The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's What Has Changed in Oracle Commerce Endeca from 3.x to 11.x webinar brought to you by PipelinePros and Oracle. Before we begin, I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. All attendees have been placed into listen-only mode. Please insert any questions you have for today's presenter into the questions module. If you experience any technical difficulties during today's webinar, please troubleshoot those using the chat module. A recording of today's webinar can be found under the Community tab on pipelinepros.org within 24 hours of the conclusion of this webcast. Now we ask that you sit back and enjoy today's webinar. At this time, I will turn the webcast over to Dalen.
Good day, good morning, and good afternoon. I hope I covered most of everyone. My name is Devine Graph. I'm a Principal Technical Support Engineer in Oracle's e-commerce support team. Today, this afternoon, we'll be looking at where we've come from in terms of 3.x, Oracle Commerce Endeca 3.x, and where we're at today with 11.3, 11.x. So let's go ahead and get started. Sorry, my slide isn't working. Let me switch over. So before we begin, I have to present to you the safe harbor statement. I'll go ahead and go silent just for a moment so you can review it. I'll go ahead and go forward from there. So today, from an agenda standpoint, we'll cover, in order to really have a conversation of where we've been, we have to have a starting point in terms of where we're coming from. We'll talk about rules, assembler, content handling. One of the cool features I like in 3.11.2 and 11.3 is the ability to create projects. There's this preview panel with some metadata that you can filter some information on. The coolest feature that occurred in 11.2, exists also in 11.3, is the ability to get to the ICR repository through REST endpoints. Then the final slide is on what's new. It points to some articles that you can go and moss and bookmark. So there are actually a lot of different changes that have occurred in from 3 to 11.x. To get into that conversation is rather expensive. So I'll try to focus more in terms of what changes, performance changes, if you will, with assembler, content handling, data ingest, experience manager features that we touched on with project and with preview, and then my favorite, the REST services. So in terms of where we're at with 3.x, where we're coming from, as you may be aware, many of you are probably aware, 3.x used the Discover application as the demo application. 3.x, even in 11.x, a lot of the content is stored in the ECR repository, as old heads call it. I call it the ICR repository, where in the ICR repository we store rules, triggers, thesauruses, redirects, your content pages. We keep up there not only your authoring, but also your live dedraft content. For the ATG integration, it uses the product catalog deployment template, where that differs. So that's the CRS deployment, demo application, where it differs with Discover. Discover CRS uses CAS. Discover uses Forge. It's more file-based. Uses the pipeline from Forge. From the authoring, from assembler standpoint, when with 3.x, assembler, when assembler starts out, it call to a SOAP call the ISDR repository that lives on tools and frameworks gets a copy or a snapshot of the ISDR repository, stores it into cache. And then on the other side, the dgraphs do something very similar. Call the ISDR repository. So there's this dependency that the ISDR repository be up and running for the ability to connect to it. And the dgraph then indexes that information directly into the dgraph. So these last bullets make reference to there is a dependency on Workbench that it be up and running. So there's the possibility of a single point of failure. Workbench is up and running. You can end up with issues with indexing. You can end up with issues where pages are slow to load or just don't load at all, and your content's not available. That last bullet, before I flipped away, also said you can run into a problem if you end up with a farm of assemblers, application servers running assembler. They're all starting up at once. It can put a load on tools and frameworks on the ISDR repository. This slide talks about the dgraphs, what they do in terms of at startup, the dgraphs call the ISDR repository, pull the information down, indexes it during update. If you run a promote content or you're running an index, that content gets refreshed from the ISDR repository and pushed into either assembler or pushed down into the dgraph. Bullet notes that it requires a direct connection to the ISDR repository. If that connection were to be severed, you could end up with issues. Another problem that occurs here is that we put the rules triggers into the dgraph, and that made the response sizes, could make the response sizes what we call bloated. To me, bloated is anything over 200K. So if you end up, let's say, with megabyte response sizes, you hit the dgraph with a query, the response size comes back and it's greater than, let's say, 200K or a megabyte, it can cause performance issues. The dgraph can be slow in responding, and pages on your site could then be slow to respond or the content not be rendered. Another part that we made a change with is with supplemental objects. We used to include the HTML and comments that occurred with supplemental objects. Now we removed that. We only include the metadata. So the supplemental objects are much smaller. And so, so the response size is you make a query to the dgraph, comes back with a response. The supplemental objects could make the response size bloated, which could potentially cause performance issues on the dgraph and pages slow to respond. So in 11.x, we've made a few changes. Those who are familiar with ATG and the ability to create segments within ATG, to me, segments are what I call dynamic groups. You create a rule that looks at, instead of putting users into specific groups, you create a rule that says, if an attribute of a user matches my rule, therefore they're a part of my group or a part of my segment. So you can create these segments within the VCC and then use those segments within Experience Manager. So then now you have the ability to push content to specific segments. So as with 3x, we still have available the Commerce Reference Store, which uses Experience Manager. We also now have available the Commerce Store Accelerator, which is more tightly knitted with the ATG and Endeca integration. We've moved away from huge change here. We moved away from this dependency of having to rely on that tools and frameworks be up and running so we can get to the content in the ISDR repository. Instead, now, a lot of that information is now pushed down into a content.zip for your live dgraph or to these generational files for your authoring dgraph. So the rules, the thesaurus, your pages, all that is in the ICR repository is zip down, or excuse me, compressed down and put into the zip file. I think for those who are familiar with using the run command with, I think it's export node, export application, or export content, that outputs a zip file. Very similar here, where we're taking the ICR repository and putting it down into a zip and storing that down onto a file. Now, instead, and this will be covered in a few slides here, instead what occurs is when assembler starts up at startup, instead of having it to make a call to the ICR repository to get the information, it looks at the zip file. So technically here, tools and frameworks can be down, and the assemblers can still get to the content, although the ICR repository is not available. Likewise, Dgraph are now looking at this content.zip versus looking at looking at tools and frameworks in the ICR repository. So some of these bullets say that assembler is now entirely independent of Workbench, meaning it's looking at the zip file. It's no longer making those sub-calls to the ICR repository. Likewise with the Dgraph. There have been some changes with preview. We've also gone in and taken this concept, those who are familiar with ATG and the DCC and content administration, the ability to create projects, some of that concept has now been pulled forward into Experience Manager, meaning you have the ability to create projects within Experience Manager and create multiple projects. So users can either work in one project or many projects, or multiple users can access a project. So you have the ability to go in, create this project, test that project within preview, make edits as you need to if the content doesn't render as you want it to, and create projects that meet your different business needs. Some other changes include, I believe some of you may have run into when creating an index for different, you would have to create an index for each language. Well, with OLT, the indexes are now taking advantage of OLT, so one index can run for many different languages. You also can use wildcard searching with OLT. This next bullet, where it talks about the JET JDK, or SDK, excuse me, means that you can do some customizations within Experience Manager. For those who were at the PipelinePros conference towards the end of July, early August, Gary Kirshner, one of the project manager for e-commerce, made a comment that we're moving away from, or we're moving to making a lot of the application available through REST endpoints. And so we're moving away from using XML to using JSON, because we're trying to make a lot of this content available through REST endpoints. So we've gone away from using these XMLs, we're now using JSON. The last bullet points to a problem that we saw with some installs, where the left, if you go into Experience Manager, you have the ability to folder content items, cartridges, rules, triggers, and you can have multiple. And so you could end up with an extensive tree, a very large, extensive tree. And in 3.x, when you try to pull that up, the page, because of the amount of content that was there, of that tree, you could run into a performance hang. The page would either hang or completely not load. So in 11.2, 11.3, we've made some improvements there so that the page loads in a more reasonable fashion. So next, let's have a conversation about rules, assembler, and content handling. So kind of touched on this a little bit before. Rules, we're moving away from including the rules or rules triggers in the D graph. We're trying to push that information out into assembler and store that information there. The advantage there is that the size of the response, where the D graph comes back a response, trying to get it under 200K. The size of the response is much smaller. We talked about the supplemental object. Now we're taking out the HTML, not including the HTML, not including the content, just including the metadata. So the supplemental objects are much smaller. So these next bullets just kind of reiterate the same thing. The payload, the response size is much smaller. And so the D graphs tend to be a lot more nimble and able to, the response times have greatly decreased. Stepping back here into the authoring D graph, giving a little bit more definition of what's occurring. When you're working when you're working with an experience manager, working within these projects, and you make a save, and you want to see that change, on the backside, what's occurring is we're creating a generational file. So the authoring D graph is grabbing the information from the generational file, running that query, and then presenting it on your site. So again, just kind of iterating that we're no longer have this dependency occurring on trying to reach the ICR repository on tools and frameworks. So again, every time you click save, we create these generational files. For the live D graph, every time, so one of the comments or questions that ends up coming up is, if you're working within Experience Manager, you create a project and you're viewing that information, how does that eventually get out? Well, only information that goes to your live D graph is the information that you specifically publish out. So when you do a publish, and you do a promote, and you eventually run a baseline, or you run an index, or you run a promote content, that's when we update the content.zip for the D graph, and then the D graph references that content.zip. So again, that content.zip is going to contain your triggers, your pages, your thesauruses. Basically, all that is in your ICR repository. So these last few bullets talk about, okay, what's occurring when you run the promote content, where you grab the D graph configuration, you grab the snapshot of your rules triggers that you've created in Experience Manager, drop that down into the zip file. Either the D graph or assembler then references that zip file to retrieve the content. Some of this information gets repeated here. Response sizes are a little bit smaller, significantly smaller, hopefully, because no longer including the supplemental objects, and the rules triggers have been pulled away. They're now being stored in assembler versus in the D graph. This last bullet comes up for us in support a lot with the ability, we want the ability to be able to take a D graph and maybe put it into another environment. So from a support standpoint, we can come back to a customer and say, can you provide your input directory, your configuration snapshot, and the content.zip, so that we can bring that D graph in-house, start up internally, and then run queries to kind of see what you're seeing. Likewise, you have the ability to take D graph that you're running in your production environments, bring it down into a test environment, and then run queries against it to see perhaps why you're experiencing an issue in your production environment. So let's step further into a conversation about projects and within preview. So again, projects were introduced with 11.2. This whole concept that started out in the ATG world, in the DCC, content administration, those who are familiar. The ability to create these buckets or these sandboxes, make your changes, have multiple changes within that project, be able to use preview to test those, those changes, and then if you need to, publish them out as you need. Multiple users can work within a project, or a user can have multiple projects. I would say, we'll go a little further down in these slides. When you're creating a project, you have the ability to create a name for a project. So develop a naming convention that makes sense, that tells what the project is. What are you wanting to accomplish with that project? We do record who created it, but something that says at a glance, I know what this project is for. Here, the screenshot on the right-hand side gives you a pictorial view where you can go in and see, you click on this drop-down, allows you to create the project. And then when you go through the project, within this view also, as you have multiple projects, so you have the ability to see all the projects. And if you click on a project, you can see all the changes within that project. There's one note here that I did want to make, and it's kind of pointed out here, where it says, this highlight with workspaces. In an ATG content administration world, we have this concept of a timeline. And when you have a project and you roll it out, there are some business cases where you run into an issue and you need to roll back the project. So you roll back the project and everything along with it to a specific point in time on that timeline. That rollback feature was not carried forward. We only carried forward the ability to create a bucket, a sandbox to make changes. We didn't carry forward the concept of doing a rollback. So if you publish your changes, the only way to get back is to go create a project that contains the changes that you had previously and then push that back out. So this slide is just, again, kind of noting, you can click on a project, you view to see your list of projects, or you can click to see the changes that occur within a project. Preview. So with preview, as you're creating these projects, on the left-hand panel, you'll see this on the left-hand side, you'll see this metadata panel. And this metadata panel allows for you to enter information like a time and a date, or a segment, or what type of device that content should be rendered on, and the rules that should be triggered when you match that information. You can see that. So if you wanted content to appear for a specific user, you can enter that into the metadata and see if that information gets triggered. Or if you want content to be rendered at a specific time, you could enter that information into the metadata to find out what is triggered when you reach that time. So you can test your triggers, your rules, to see if they fire when you expect them to, and what is rendered. So in this next slide here, you kind of see on the breakout the information that you can, at the top, on the top left hand, on the left hand nav, the meta panel, what you can modify. On the bottom section of that, again on the left hand side, you can see the cartridges that fired. Then over on the right, the main panel, the main frame, you can see your actual operand site to see what fired. So you get a view of the cartridges, the rules that fired, the rules triggers that fired, and the actual page. There was, so Forge and content acquisition system, CAS. Forge is a 32-bit system. So we weren't able to take advantage of it on 64-bit environment. So we weren't able to grow with it, so we moved away from it. So now Forge is gone, and we're just using CAS. CAS is robust in the sense that you can use Java manipulators to modify the data. It's also pretty cool in the sense that you can create these CAS crawls to crawl different repositories or different URLs to retrieve the content that you need. And this last bullet points out too, for those who are moving who are currently using Forge and wanting to move to 11.x, there is this utility, Forge has utility to help you migrate. Some of this we covered, including CAS includes a dimension value ID manager that keeps track of your dimensions. So as you get new dimensions, it's going to keep track of them. You can also use CAS command line tools to interact with your data. One of the cool things for us here in support is we have better improved logging with CAS, make it easier to troubleshoot issues. CAS, last bullet, points out that CAS can take advantage of sites that use NCLM version 2 compatible with. This is the part, the REST API. To me, this is probably one of the coolest features that was released with 11.x series, which is the ability to get to the content in the ISDR repository through a REST endpoint. So not only can you query it, but you can also update it or delete content that's up there. So you can modify the content that is up there and do it all through a REST endpoint. The real advantage here is, to me, is the ability to script, you create your own script, and not have necessarily human interaction where someone has to modify a file, go in, and because a lot of the documentation says you can use the endpoints to download to a zip file or to a JSON file, modify that JSON file, and then upload it. To me, there are already a lot of tools that kind of already do that within Endeca. The real benefit to me is the ability to go ahead and create a script that does all the work for you. So what I'm saying is you can create your own script that use these endpoints, take the JSON payload, and then upload that into your ISDR repository to make the necessary edit and do it all through scripting. So it's JAX RS 2.0 compliant. As noted, allows easier integration with other systems. Some of these bullets are pointing out that we already currently have tools like the run command where you do an export content, export node or export application, which requires that the user has physical access to where you're running your Endeca application. Here, because it's REST endpoint, you don't have to give the user direct access to the box. You can, if you will, tell them to make their changes. So the use cases, you can say, hey, create this text file, put that into a directory. You use a script to read the text file, drop that into a JSON payload, and upload that using the endpoint into the ISDR repository. Last what it says, schedule job. You need to point out what it's saying is you can create a cron job to run your script. There isn't necessarily a scheduled feature that occurs with the REST endpoint. So you can use these. This is an example here, this first bullet of the GSA admin endpoint to be able to make updates on the thesauruses. Here, it's making note that you can download the file as a JSON or as a zip. Here, it's possible. This isn't, to me, the greatest advantage of this, but it's saying here that you have the ability to use the endpoint to download the file to a local directory, so the person doesn't have to have physical access to either the directory where you're hosting your application, or necessarily need to have access to Workbench, excuse me, not Workbench, Experience Manager. They don't need to have access to Experience Manager. You can use the endpoint to download this information to, hit the URL, download the zip file or download JSON locally to your box, you update that JSON or uncompress that zip and update the JSON, and then use the endpoint to upload it back into the ISDR repository. Using JSON, it does require authentication. So just want to point out that the authentication method for on-premise, so the Endeca on-premise is going to be a little bit different than the authentication for, let's say, cloud. Cloud, you first log in to use the endpoints to log on to, let's say, CC admin. And then you can use your token to log into the GSA admin endpoint for the ISDR repository. And on the on-premise side, you use JSecurity check, I believe it's called, to log in. And then once you have this cookie, this token, you can drop that in as a cookie, and then you can use the rest of the GSA admin endpoint. Another point that's different between on-premise and that in cloud is the endpoint start out here. It shows GSA admin v1 and then the application name, which is Discover in this example. For on-premise, it's ISDR. You put ISDR in front of it, GSA admin v1, and then the name of your application, Discover. I have CS, CSA, I think I have on a test box is my application name. For cloud, you drop the ISDR. The endpoints start with GSA admin v1, and cloud is always the name of the application. Last slide here is what's new, which points to some solutions, articles that are up on MyOracle support. I'll leave the slide up here for a moment so you can copy things down. I encourage you to go up to MyOracle support, bookmark these to give you information on what's been updated for 11.3, 11.2, 11.0. And then from there, I'll pause and see if there are any questions.
Thanks, Dalen. Again, if you have any questions for today's presenter, please insert those into the questions module on the right-hand portion of your screen. We'll wait a few moments to see if we have any questions that are submitted. While we are waiting, we do want to remind everyone that the Insight Europe conference is taking place next week in Lisbon, Portugal. So if you've not made plans and you still want to join us, there is time. You can visit pipelinepros.org/InsightEurope for more details on all of the presentations and the registration information. Also mark your calendars for Insight 19 taking place in Austin, Texas, August 26th through 28th. Registration will open on November 15th with a super early bird rate this year, giving you an additional discount on pricing. So please make note of that, and stay tuned to your Pipeline Pros newsletter for more details. Again, if you have any questions, please insert those into the into the questions module on the right-hand portion of your screen. We do have one question. Is there any changes to the indexing logic? Dalen, I think you're actually on mute. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I apologize. Can you elaborate on your question? Because I'm going to answer with not really. But I want to see where you're going with your question.
Okay. So Santosh, if you could add just a little bit more clarification to that using the chat feature, we will be more than happy to clarify for you. Again, for anyone else, if you want to ask a question, now is your time. Please insert those questions into the questions module on the right-hand portion of your screen. We'll give it just a minute here for some clarification on the question. Actually, we've had a couple of other questions come in while he is reposting his question. Is Forge feature ability taken out of 11.3? Is it recommended to use in certain scenarios where we use it to join data.
So we're no longer using Forge. It's not available for 11.3, 11.2, 11.3. I think it's just period 11.x. We're no longer using it. It couldn't grow with us, so we're just no longer using it. There is a utility to help you migrate CAS to, or Forge to CAS utility to help you migrate, but no, we're not using Forge anymore.
Is there ability to do personalization in Endeca?
Using personalization that exists in ATG, I believe that's where the question is coming from. You have the ability to create cartridges, but not use personalization outside of the segment.
Fantastic. If there are any additional questions, please feel free to insert those into the questions module. We'll give it just another moment here to see if we have any additional questions. We do have a follow-up question here. Are there any performance improvements related to related changes for indexing, like bringing down the indexing times?
So part of that answer is yes, because we're not storing as much information. So those supplemental objects, we're not storing as much. The trigger information, we're not storing as much. So not only does that help in terms of query time, but also in terms of indexing.
Okay. The next question is there any AI or machine learning search abilities coming in the future for guided search?
If you're familiar with Gary Kirshner, that is a Gary Kirshner question for sure. I'm not able to talk about what we're planning on doing in the future with the application.
Great. The next question
Gary
is...
Kirshner is the project. Just finishing that. Gary Kirshner is the project manager for e-commerce.
Perfect. As you mentioned, Forge is not in 11.3 to do. Do we support existing Forge applications?
That's where we're saying you can use the utility Forge to CAD utility to bring you forward from your Forge application into 11.3.
Okay. If we have a huge catalog of around 300,000 products in 10 different languages, is it better to use the index for each language, or can we use a single index? Use a separate index for each language, or use a single index?
So I think that question is probably going to get a little bit more detailed in terms of if you're running into a problem. Well, with 11.3, sticking with OLT, you don't need to have multiple indexes for each language. So you don't need to, let's say, have a French index and an English index. You can have multiple languages, and a Graph via OLT can now serve multiple languages.
And the last question, I think this one's also probably for Gary, but I will throw it out there anyway. Any plans for making Endeca app a fully headless model? I'm assuming that's for Gary and the product team.
Yeah, forward questions I can't answer. Those are Gary questions.
The next question is, has 11.3 totally got rid of Flex UI? Is it easy to do changes in XM related to UI?
We're moving away from it. I think Gary kind of touched on that question at the PipelinePros presentation. 11.3 is still using it, but we're starting to move away from it.
And is it easy to do changes in the XM related UI?
The JET SDK allows for you to do some customization with Experience Manager. I hope that answers that portion of the question.
All right. We'll give it just one more moment. Yep, here we have another question. Can you do guided search without using Experience Manager? We have a client who doesn't have the Experience Manager license?
There's a deployment template or Discover that doesn't utilize Experience Manager, and so you're like hitting these services to pull back information.
Fantastic.
So there's a template that I want to say. There's a Discover demo application that uses a template. There's two of them, three of them. I can't see them all right now, but one of them is like services. Then it has an extension on it that says services, and that doesn't use Experience Manager.
Is there a current end date for Oracle supporting 3.1?
First name, Dalin, D-A-L-I-N, .bell@oracle.com. Let me get back to you on that question. I don't know that answer right off the bat. I have to go ask, and then I'm not sure if we would release it. So I don't know the answer, is what I'm trying to say. I don't know the answer right now. If you email me, Dalin, .bell@oracle.com, I can get back to you on that answer.
All right. Give it just another moment for additional questions. Again, if you do think of questions after today's webcast, you can feel free to email those to info@pipelinepros.org. We'll be happy to follow up with Dalin and get a response for the questions that we are able to get responses to. If there are forward-related questions, we can also pass those along to the product team and get a response back as well. I think that does conclude the questions for today's webinar. So I want to thank everyone for attending What's Changed in Oracle Commerce Endeca from 3.x to 11x webcast. You can find a video playback of this webinar under the Community tab within 24 hours. If you have feedback or suggestions for other webinar topics, please email us at info@pipelinepros.org. Again, thank you for attending. This does conclude today's webcast.
Thank you.